For more resources, visit rymonline.org.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
All right, everybody, welcome back. We're talking with Collin Hansen all this week, talking about questions focused on his book, Young, Restless, Reformed. Collin, throughout the book, you do a good bit of traveling. We just talked about that yesterday, and interviewing several individuals. And I was just curious, what are your top 3 or so? You can top 3, 5 memories from your travels. This could be an interview or an experience that you had while you were traveling.
Gosh, there were a lot of them, John. One of the most fascinating parts there was being able to go back, go to Yale University, go down in their Beinecke Rare Books library, and to sit there and actually to look at and to hold a copy of the notes that Jonathan Edwards used to preach his most famous sermon, and probably the most famous sermon in American history, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Wow.
Just being able to be in that environment and to see, just coming from growing up in South Dakota, it's not a very historical place. It's not that old of a place. But going back into New England and going back into the early 1700s and thinking about what it would have been like back then was just absolutely fascinating to me, and fascinating to juxtapose that with today. We're talking about this resolutely religious and evangelical and reformed part of the country that's now the most secular part of the country. That was just a kind of a challenge to think through. If you go to Northampton, Massachusetts today, it's certainly going to be a lot less well known for the exploits of Jonathan Edwards than it would be for a certain kind of certain brand of feminism today. And so that's just fascinating to be in that area and just traveling there in the middle of winter. It's dark and walking through some of the same woods that Jonathan Edwards would have walked through, and as he would pray and reflect on God. That was actually from a later visit to that area, but that piece stuck out as well. I remember getting ready to fly to Minneapolis to meet with John Piper. And I didn't know him very well at the time at all. I think we had just corresponded a little bit, maybe even just with his secretary, about setting up a trip. And I remember basically realize as I'm getting ready to go out there, he's talking about what we're going to do after the evening service. And I realized that I basically invited myself over to his house. I mean, because I thought like, well, I mean, we'll just do whatever he's doing. He's like, well, usually I go back to my house and just kind of decompress and eat a bowl of Cheerios or something like that. And
I think it's grape nuts or something.
Yeah, grape nuts. Thank you. There it is. Thank you, grape nuts. You reminded me of grape nuts. I'm the Cheerios fan. He's the grape nuts fan. And so I'm sitting there like, I'm like, well, that'll work for me. I'll just, like, okay. So I remember walking around and I was looking for the TV in there. I've read Don't Waste Your Life. No TV anywhere. All right. I've been working with him now for more than a decade since then, and that was really memorable for me. I think also the last chapter, kind of almost an epilogue of the book. I'm right in my own home area, just from a few miles away from where I grew up, in a place called Del Rapids, South Dakota, and I'm meeting with a friend who came from that same youth ministry. And I see this church that he's planted and the way that they're just doing ordinary church ministry, loving people, sharing the gospel, preaching, administering the ordinances, church discipline, pastoral care, all that sort of stuff. And I'm hearing about just this network of churches planted and revitalized and transformed in all sorts of different small towns throughout South Dakota where I grew up. And I just remember thinking, this is so different from anything that I ever experienced growing up and anything that I ever would have expected growing up. And even since then, the town where actually the Baptist church where a lot of the leaders had been instrumental in this revival ministry where I came to know the Lord, they just hired a pastor who helped find that job through the Gospel Coalition's job board. Came from Southern California, San Diego, from seminary out there to come to this small Baptist church in this town, and town where I grew up going to church. And just that stuck with me of just kind of bringing it home for me to know that this wasn't just something that I'd run off to Chicago and learned, and that I would find just in Seattle and Minneapolis and Chicago and New York and places like that. But actually, this was a movement of God that was happening with my friends, even back in these rural areas where I grew up, and that just filled me with a great deal of encouragement and hope for this movement of God enduring over the course of years and decades.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I know, like you said, there's so many memories, so many experiences, so many interviews you had with people who were, more on the famous end of the spectrum, and then those who were just college students. So I'm sure we could fill up an entire podcast easily just discussing those. So anyway, those are some good highlights. Thanks for sharing those.
Thanks, John.